Thank you for the warm welcome, John, and thank you all for being here. We're so grateful to the Foundation for being our partner with us on this project. And as John said, the focus is on three tensions, which I will get to. Additionally, the project is aimed at drawing together a diverse community of scholars around the challenges, the key challenges we face within a free society. And the tensions that John identified, we see as being pivotal in really setting a course for our present century. And so, again, I'm going to recap those here. The first is the tension between free speech and on the one hand and social cohesion on the other. Freedom of expression is, of course, essential to a free society. But those protections extend, as we know, to offensive and uncivil speech as well, which can be in tension with the norms and the desire for respect and civility and truthfulness. And these are norms, these and other norms contribute to social trust, right? And so when that trust is eroded, it's something for us to worry about, because that also, it's like that social glue that holds a society together. So the key question here is, how do we maintain both freedom of expression and also the strength of that social glue? Now, liberal democracies also wrestle with the tension between individual liberty and equality. Now, in a free society, we champion both, of course, but liberty and equality can pull and tug against one another when, for example, disparities in wealth leave some people with greater influence and power within the democratic process. Now, that's a long-standing concern within the liberal tradition, but the sweeping and rapid transformation in technology that we're experiencing gives us fresh versions of those concerns. And there's also a tension, as John noted, between the dynamism we experience within a free society and the very human desire for stability. We rightly celebrate progress that is afforded by cultural and economic dynamism. And at the same time, if the effects of that dynamism are social fragmentation and polarization that threaten to undermine the liberal order itself, we have, again, serious reason for being concerned. And so this project has been around leaning into all of these tensions. Now, as John noted, IHS comes to this work from the classical liberal tradition. Our baseline belief is that the ideas of political, economic, cultural, and intellectual freedom underlie the good society, a pluralistic and tolerant society in which both individuals and communities thrive in a context of peace, prosperity, intellectual openness, and with a respect for the dignity of all people. But to really grapple with the tensions that I've just laid out, we need to foster discourse not just among classical liberals, but among a more capacious community of liberal scholars, left of center liberals, classical liberals, Madisonian conservative scholars, who all still are cheering for the success and pushing for the success of the liberal project, but who recognize that they should have a healthy dissatisfaction with breezy responses that too easily dismiss the hard challenges that we do face within free societies. And so far in the project, we've supported 321 cross-disciplinary research deliverables around these three themes. And the challenge I set for myself, you'll be very happy to know, was not to go through a précis of each of the 321 research deliverables, but instead to identify, as John said, the leading edges of the project where the conversations are most fruitful. And again, not because the scholars have come up with very firm conclusions necessarily, but because it's the area where the stakes are high, the answers are not obvious, and where intellectual attention is most urgently needed. Now, I'll talk through each of these tensions in turn, but I also want to point to some of the overarching themes that have emerged in the course of the project. And one of those meta themes is that the fresh challenges we're experiencing within a free society tend to be situated less within the hard surfaced arenas of constitutional design and public policy, and more in that boggier terrain of habits, norms, and sensibilities. Now, to give you a better sense of what I mean by this, I'd like to pull the lens back a bit and sketch out the contours of the liberal project. So if I may, I'd like to share my screen, and it'll be just for a few minutes, and then I'll come back. All right, if someone can give me a shout out or a thumbs up that everybody's seeing the four corners of liberalism. Hearing no objections. Yes. I can't see. Yes, good. Thank you so much. So think of this as a sort of map that helps us navigate the elements of the liberal project classically understood. The principles of political liberalism up there in the sort of northwestern corner, they're the most familiar to us as Americans because these are the ideas and principles that are embedded within founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. All people are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, and the role of government is to secure those rights. These are the principles of political liberalism. Now, over on the other side, in the sort of northeastern corner, is economic liberalism, maybe less well recognized within popular civic education, but important to the liberal project because it provides the conditions that underlie market societies. The mother of what economic historian Deirdre McCloskey calls the hockey stick of human betterment, the 3,000% increase in material well-being we've experienced over the past 250 or so years. So let me pause here to note that it's in the sort of northern upper half of the map where formal rules and public policy questions tend to reside. As we navigate down to the lower half of the map, we move into civic terrain of habits, norms, and sensibilities. Intellectual liberalism in the sort of southeastern corner here, for example, represents a complex set of norms that favor not only free speech, which is back up in the political liberalism corner, but an attitude of openness, humility, and a welcoming of intellectual challenge. You can't really pass a law to get those sensibilities. It's like it's kind of baked into a sort of a set of cultural norms. And I'll note before I leave the intellectual liberalism corner that it's this corner that really animates the modern university when it is serving at its best. The modern university is really a legacy of Enlightenment era liberalism. And when it's at its best, it's really practicing the principles embedded within that, including academic freedom in that corner. So similarly, the cultural liberalism in the southwest corner fosters a default attitude of toleration, one that says, so long as you're respecting the rights of others, you can pursue the good life as you understand it, and I can do the same. You can worship your God, I can worship mine, or none at all. And at the end of the day, maybe we meet up for a coffee or a pint and swap stories about our lives. The point is that we're not only legally permitted to do this, it's our default attitude. It's one that invites the sort of whirl of pluralism. I also want to draw attention to these arrows that I've got here because they signify the relationship that each corner has with each of the other corners. And these relationships are very often mutually reinforcing. So think of the open contest of ideas that's down there in the intellectual liberalism corner. That open contest of ideas fuels innovation, which in turn supports the success of the economic liberalism part of the project. And I'd also suggest that academic freedom is a complex set of norms that resides in the intellectual pluralism corner, but it can't exist if we don't have a baseline protection of free speech and freedom of association that we see in the political liberalism corner. So that's what I mean by that mutually reinforcing aspect of the relationship. But these arrows also point to tensions, right? So for example, the whirl of economic dynamism that we see in the economic liberalism corner is in tension with democratic norms that rest inside the political liberalism corner that say want to try to dampen down some of that liberalism, and that those two things are in tension with one another. And as I already indicated, the principles of the First Amendment that are embedded within political liberalism are oftentimes in tension with a set of cultural norms that value respect and civility. Now, I find the map helpful first because it reminds us that the liberal project is as much about our cultural and moral sensibilities, the lower half of the map, as it is about the formal rules that reside in the upper half. The second reason I find the map helpful is that it helps us to see that the tensions we encounter within a free society are not flaws, right? The tensions are part of the system. Think of the tensions, I like to think of it as like the tensions in a suspension bridge, right? The tugging and pulling, as well as the reinforcing, is what makes the thing work. Let me stop sharing my screen now. And can you all see me okay? I will take that as a yes. So let's talk about the specific tensions that this project is engaging, beginning with the tension between freedom of expression and social cohesion. Now, for good reason, liberals are principally concerned oftentimes with government infringement on freedom of expression, and vigilance is as needed now as it ever has on that front. That said, the restrictions that most people are experiencing, I would say in the United States anyway, are coming now less from government and more from civil society itself. While it was once easy to ignore the disapproving opinion of busybody neighbors, now those same neighbors can broadcast their criticism and generate a piling on in what political scientist Luke Sheehan calls degradation ceremonies that can lead to not only the loss of community, but a loss of livelihood as well. These incidents raise serious questions. As philosopher Piers Ben asks, when does counter-speech, criticism, and disapproval cross the line into intimidation and suppression? Social media platforms have attempted to establish standards for what can and cannot be said in the virtual public square, but when does that standard setting itself constitute an unacceptable abridgment of speech freedoms? Now, if we accept that framing that the public square has moved online, our impulse may be to force social media platforms to abide by First Amendment principles or something close to it. But has it? Has the town square actually moved online? Or more provocatively, co-authors Andrew I. Cohen and Andrew J. Cohen ask, has the town square, as it has been idealized in the public imagination, ever really existed? Throughout most of American history, racism, sexism, and literal, distance from the literal town square meant that most people could not participate. So, but even if we accept that social media platforms are providing something like a public square, does that mean that such platforms should refrain from content moderation of its users? Cohen and Cohen argue that much of the censorship that we experience, and they do describe it as censorship, by social media platforms is in a liberal order that respects private property rights entirely permissible. When we have complaints about the ways that social media platforms treat us, according to this view, we're not making legal arguments, we're making moral arguments. Now, especially in the wake of a recent Supreme Court decision that followed precisely this language, this logic, this line of thinking throws the challenge right back into civil society's lap. We need conceptual clarity and moral philosophical grounding on what governing principles, and by that I don't mean government regulation, I mean governing principles, bottom-up governing principles, should private providers of the public square, what governing principles should they pursue and what should they avoid? And if part of their goal is to help support a healthy civic society. Now, you'll hear echoes of this challenge when I turn to the liberty and equality tension in a moment. But before leaving the free speech and social cohesion tension, I would be remiss if I did not raise this question. What are our responsibilities as participants in these spaces? What are our responsibilities to the liberal democratic order? What discursive norms should we adopt and which should we avoid in conducting ourselves in these spaces? So as one example, philosophers Brandon Warnke and Justin Tosi point to the problematic norm they call blocking the exits. Rather than praising someone for being willing to change their mind, instead, we have a tendency to punish the flip-flopper. If our own compatriots are caught taking the other side's argument too seriously, we punish them for failing the partisan loyalty test. And we often do this, Warnke and Tosi argue, not because we're actually trying to, improve the state of the world, but because we're seeking status, or we're seeking to secure our existing status within our own groups. And it's this kind of activity. I would add just one other thing here is that in addition to, blocking the exits, we also have a tendency to block the entrances as well, especially when it comes to, core important moral shifts in a moral perspective. We tend to treat people who change their mind, and I'm talking about people who now agree with us, as if they are kind of morally polluted for having a different point of view previously. We don't want them in our ranks because of fear of catching some sort of moral pathogen. And so by raising the costs of both exit and entry, we incentivize, Warnke and Tosi argue, in-group extremism, we erode social trust and cohesion, and fuel affective polarization. The kind of polarization that doesn't just say, oh, I disagree with you, the kind of polarization that says you're evil and you're so evil that you're not worthy of even a hearing. Now, it may be possible to develop better discursive norms, but much of that work will be done in the private sphere of civil society. This is an area where a lot more consequential scholarly work can be done to drive conceptual clarity and a deeper understanding of the normative trade-offs involved. Another overarching theme that goes to the heart of the liberal project emerges from the equality and liberty tension. Liberalism champions procedural neutrality in which all citizens are treated as equals in the political and legal process. Government is not permitted, according to this principle, to stack the deck in favor of one group or another. Now, given the many examples that we can point to where procedural neutrality was obviously violated, from the slave trade to Jim Crow to limited franchise, redlining, and unequal treatment in the criminal justice system, just to name a few, a key question is whether the principle of procedural neutrality can be defended at all. And in fact, this line of thinking informs longstanding critiques, typically from the progressive left against liberalism. Now, the principle of neutrality might survive such critiques by pointing to the ideal as the guiding principle, a sort of North Star that helps us steer the ship in the right direction, even if we have yet to reach our destination. And within our project, we're seeing excellent work of this kind. Political scientist Ilya Murtazashvili and legal scholar Adam Kripelli have edited a collection investigating the consequences of 19th century Supreme Court decisions that rendered Indian nations essentially wards of the federal government. To this day, these decisions subject tribal citizens to a dramatically different rule structure that limits their political and their economic freedom. This is an arena where a classical liberal perspective is casting much needed light. But the leading edge of the liberty and equality tension conceptually is once again further from the hard surfaces of constitutional jurisprudence and public policy and closer to the moral terrain of private civil society. Take, for instance, the emergence of activist capitalism, in which corporations adopt stances on consequential moral questions. In one sense, this is not new. Private firms have long expressed particular values, say by refraining from business activity that clashes with, that does not align with their worldview. I'm thinking, for example, of Quaker metal fabricators in the 17th and 18th centuries who made farm and household equipment, but who refused to make weapons of war. Today, companies who credibly commit to carbon neutrality are operating in essentially the same spirit. And under the banner of corporate social responsibility, it's common for corporations to promote moral goods like breast cancer awareness, poverty alleviation, or increased access to arts education. But scholars are recognizing that the new activist capitalism is different. It's not just about aligning your own internal business practices with a particular value system. And it's not just promoting moral goods that pretty much everybody can get on board with. Contemporary activist capitalism increasingly advances moral goods that, by their very nature, appeal to one part of the citizenry and excludes the other. Now, at first blush, we may not see this as much of a problem at all. Private organizations, like private citizens, we might say, can hold and champion any point of view they see fit and have no legal or moral obligation to refrain from advancing activist positions. And, and I fully admit to, giving a kind of cheer when I hear corporations coming out and being vocal on the side of basic civil liberties. But as political economists Sara Mascanelli and Simone Sepe argue, the new activist capitalism, no matter whether its motivation is, kind of reflecting left of center or right of center moral preferences, does have the potential to undermine the liberal democratic order in some pretty serious ways. So that's given me some pause to think it through. First, when weighing in on difficult policy and moral challenges, corporate stances tend to be less focused on inviting deliberative discourse and more focused on identifying one side as morally pure and the other side as morally corrupt, accelerating affective polarization in an already polarized society. A still deeper concern is that by taking exclusionary moral principles, moral positions, corporations are increasingly shaping the deliberative process, the democratic deliberative process itself. Mascanelli and Sepe argue that this represents a serious equality concern, particularly in the context of big tech firms, with corporations not only taking exclusionary political positions, but hosting the platforms on which political deliberation unfolds, where they may be actually, stacking the deck in favor of one side or another through various, behind the scenes algorithmic manipulation. Corporations in this context acquire the status of a super citizen who can gain, who has greater weight than ordinary citizens in determining the outcome of collective decision making. Now, if this were government, we'd worry about this kind of influence. Citizens, not governments, should determine the direction public deliberation takes. Now, with respect to private social media platform, the question arises, is there a moral case, if not a legal one, for adopting something like the neutrality principle when it comes to establishing a position in favor of one moral stance that is going to appeal to one part of the citizenry, but exclude the other? If private corporations wish to promote moral goods, is there a case, for example, of infusing more democratic decision-making, such as adopting a supermajority requirement for activist decisions, or deploying a one-person, one-vote rule to dampen down the influence of major shareholders in, again, the public deliberative process?
Come on in. Hello, good morning. Here we go. Okay.
So even if we all agree that we should not legally require private corporations to adopt such procedures, and that's the position I hold, important ethical considerations remain for civil society to consider. And that brings us to the dynamism and stability tension. I saved this one for last because it's the tension that is at the heart of what I see as the greatest contemporary threat to a free society, and that is the rising threat of illiberalism. Freedom House reports that across the globe, the percentage of people living in societies that enjoy basic liberal democratic freedoms has dropped from 46% in 2005 to 20% in 2021. We're seeing rising authoritarianism in China, in Europe, and of course, Putin's Russia. Here at home, both the progressive left and the post-liberal nationalist conservative right are rejecting liberalism as fundamentally a failed project, and with each side jockeying for power in the arenas of politics, economics, and the wider culture. So in other words, I suggest that liberal democracies, in other words, have not faced a threat like this since the 1930s. So what's behind this threat? In part, it's the tribalism and xenophobia that have long threatened liberal societies. We're seeing this in ethno-nationalist, political, and social movements. The liberal approach to counteracting these threats have been to shine a bright light to expose the morally repugnant nature of such ideological regimes. The US Holocaust Memorial Museum is an example of this kind of approach, with each floor, just brilliantly examining not only the horrors of the Holocaust, but also the ideological underpinnings that rendered hatred and violence systemic across all facets of society. And this kind of work must continue. At the same time, we need better arguments, and not just those that counteract hard currents of illiberalism, but also its softer varieties, the anti-liberal and post-liberal movements that are rooted less in an ideology of hatred and more in the anxieties related to economic uncertainty, fear of what a changing culture might bring next, and a longing for stability and permanence. So let me begin by underscoring that liberals do have really good arguments here, especially about the benefits of open systems of cultural and market dynamism. When I began my career as an economics professor at the tail end of the last century, and I like saying it that way because it makes me sound, just really, wizened and like I've got lots of street cred here since I've moved my career into this new century. The primary concern that my fellow scholars so long ago, and those students that were listening to me in my economics lectures were presenting to me, was that things weren't changing fast enough. In response to market-oriented arguments, they'd say, if markets are so great, why is it that so many people are still suffering under that grip of oppressive poverty? And I think that it was exactly the right question and the right kind of challenge. Because I was championing change away from public policies and ascriptive cultural norms that locked people in cycles of poverty, my job as a political, economic, and cultural liberal was comparatively easy. Human betterment in the minds of my students and my colleagues was already defined as change. What we had left to talk about was how to bring about that change and what it would look like. The starting point now is very different. An overriding theme in the anti-liberal and post-liberal critiques is that stability and predictability are unalloyed goods. And it's not that our interlocutors haven't had the opportunity to read and internalize liberal arguments that favor market and cultural dynamism. It's that liberalism, in their view, has failed precisely because it's brought about such significant change. Yes, it's left us wealthier perhaps, but in their view, morally corrupt and bereft of meaning and community. Arguing against this starting point is harder, in part because resistance to change is hardwired in the human brain. We have a hardwired human bias that favors the status quo, fears change, and the uncertainty that it brings. Arguments favoring the status quo, in other words, get a sort of assist from that part of our brains that craves stability and certainty. These same impulses make the imposition of order by a strong hand from the top down similarly attractive. So in addition to the intellectual work we need to do, we also need to do some cultural work. We need to establish and help to develop new cultural defaults that begin with a posture of optimism and confidence in the face of change, and a healthy skepticism when we hear that authoritarian power is the answer. Now, I'm not championing a particular set of conclusions. I'm championing a particular set of sort of default starting points, because these are the liberal default starting points. Now, you might say that this is the work of parents, of clergy, of life coaches, mental health professionals. I agree. I think it is. And I don't mean to take anything away from these important influencers in civil society. But scholars, too, I would argue, in their role as teachers, researchers, and public intellectuals, have a part to play in enculturating liberal defaults like these as well. Mental models matter, not just to intellectual argument, but also to cultural change. Mental models of emergent order help the public understand and anticipate how order tends to follow disruption when solution seekers are free to engage in bottom-up discovery. And it's not just the mental models of economics, though I am a particular fan of these. Cultural systems as well are also adaptive, but that adaptation can be really hard to see in real time. Anthropologists, sociologists, historians, social psychologists, and yes, economists can help us understand what are the conditions under which individuals and communities can adapt, social systems can adapt, even thrive in the wake of disruption. Mental models of adaptation, in other words, help us to resist xenophobic impulses that would have us suspend the dynamic forces of a free society. And further, we can also point to intellectual efforts from public choice economics to dystopian fiction as helping us to spot the dangers of authoritarian control and develop a healthy skepticism of efforts that seek to impose strongman solutions from the top down. Now, admittedly, mental models of emergent order, the kind that help us to override our resistance to change and our attraction to authoritarian solutions, are difficult to convey. They're hard to teach, and they're even harder to grasp. It takes multiple iterations to gain that familiarity, that mental dexterity that is required to turn those mental models into usable tools that can be picked up easily and deployed with skill. Now, as it turns out, and this is going to sound really old school, but a semester-long course is remarkably well suited to this task. It allows for repeated mental practice required to gain this kind of dexterity, to acquire that hard-won intellectual tool that allows us to override our instinctive craving for stability and top-down control. Now, I'll close by saying that the tensions that we face within a free society are, again, not flaws. They're a feature. They're not a bug. Such tensions are reasons not to abandon the liberal project, but to draw scholarly attention back to it. And it is the reason why, in drawing that scholarly attention back to it, I would say that we are in keeping with Hayek's famous quote that says that it helps us to ensure that we are once again making of the free society an intellectual adventure and a deed of courage. On behalf of everyone at the Institute for Humane Studies, we're so grateful to have the John Templeton Foundation as our partner in these efforts. And I look forward to your challenges, your questions, your comments, and help us move the conversation forward. Thanks for letting me be here.